The late summer light fell through the kitchen window in long amber ribbons, catching the dust motes above the table where three women sat, surrounded by fabric swatches, seating charts, and half-empty cups of coffee. My name is Claire, and on that particular afternoon, 11 months before the wedding, I remember thinking that I had never seen my sister look so entirely, uncomplicatedly happy. "Look at this one," Emily said, sliding a swatch of ivory silk across the table toward me, her voice bright with the kind of joy that made even the dullest task glow. "Doesn't it remind you of Grandma's tablecloth, the one from the lake house?" It did. I told her so, and she beamed, reaching over to squeeze my hand the way she used to when we were girls sharing a bedroom, whispering long after we were supposed to be asleep. Our mother sat at the head of the table, glasses perched on the end of her nose, methodically working through a binder of vendor quotes with the quiet satisfaction of a woman finally getting to plan the wedding she'd dreamed of since her daughters were small. "You always had the eye for this," my mother said to me, not looking up from her spreadsheet. "Your father used to say you could organize a hurricane if someone paid you to." I laughed. It was true, in its way. I had spent 8 years building an events consulting business from nothing, coordinating corporate galas, product launches, the occasional charity dinner for the county hospital, until I had a small but respected firm with my name on the door and a reputation for making complicated things look effortless. When Emily got engaged, it seemed only natural that I would help. More than help. I wanted to help. She was my baby sister, 6 years younger, and I had spent our whole lives watching out for her, walking her to school when our parents worked double shifts, teaching her to drive in the church parking lot, sitting up with her the night her first serious boyfriend broke her heart. Planning her wedding felt like the culmination of something, not an obligation. "I already talked to the Ashford estate," I told her, pulling out my tablet. "They can hold the date, but we need to put down the deposit by Friday if we want the garden pavilion instead of the ballroom." "The garden pavilion," Emily repeated, her eyes shining. "Claire, that's the one from the magazine. That's the one I showed you." "I know." I smiled at her. "That's why I called first thing this morning." My mother reached across the table and patted my arm, the gesture warm and familiar. "What would we do without you?" she said. And I remember specifically how good those words felt. Not because I needed the praise, but because in a family where affection was often rationed, spent carefully, doled out in proportion to usefulness, that small warmth felt like sunlight after a long winter. Later that evening, my father came home from his shift at the plant, tired but smiling, and the four of us sat around the table eating my mother's pot roast while Emily talked animatedly about flowers. White peonies, she'd decided, cascading down the aisle in loose, romantic clusters. My father listened with the particular tenderness he reserved only for her, nodding along, asking questions about the guest list, the band, whether they'd finally decided on chicken or salmon for the reception dinner. "Claire's handling all of it," my mother said proudly, refilling his plate. "You should see her spreadsheets, color-coded, everything." "That's my girl," my father said. And though he was looking at Emily when he said it, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that some small part of that pride belonged to me too. I want to be honest about something. I was happy to do it. I want that understood clearly, because everything that came after might make it sound as though I'd been building a case from the beginning, watching for betrayal around every corner. I hadn't been. When I offered to use my company's vendor relationships to negotiate better rates, when I offered to put the deposits through my business accounts so we could access commercial pricing instead of retail markups, when I told my parents not to worry about the details because I would handle everything, I meant it with my whole heart. There was no calculation in it. There was only love and the particular joy of being useful to people you love. "You'll walk me down the aisle too, won't you?" Emily asked me one night, months later, as we sat on her apartment floor surrounded by ribbon samples and half-drunk glasses of wine. "Not instead of Dad, with Dad, both of you." I remember my throat tightening, the sudden warmth behind my eyes. "Of course," I said. "Of course I will." She leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she had when she was 7 and afraid of thunderstorms, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. The candle on her coffee table flickered. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off and fell silent. It was, I think now, the last purely happy moment I would have with my sister for a very long time. Though, of course, sitting there in the golden hush of that evening, I had no way of knowing that yet. "I love you," she said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you handling all this." "You'll never have to find out," I told her, and meant it completely. I had 11 months left before the wedding. I had no idea, that night, how much would change. How the woman leaning her head on my shoulder would, in less than a year, sign her name to a story that erased me entirely. Or how the invoice waiting at the end of all my careful, loving work would arrive not as a thank you, but as a bill. But that was still 11 months away. That night, there was only candlelight and ribbon samples, and my sister's head resting trustingly against my shoulder. By the time winter arrived, the wedding had stopped feeling like a joyful project and had started to feel, in the quiet hours when I finally sat down at my own kitchen table with my own bills, like a second full-time job. I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because it matters later. I had opened 3 new vendor accounts under my company's tax ID, Claire Whitfield Events, LLC, because commercial accounts got wholesale pricing on florals, linens, and catering that retail clients never saw. I had negotiated the Ashford estate down $11,000 simply by mentioning that I'd booked events there for 2 corporate clients. I had personally driven 2 hours round trip to taste test 3 different bakeries because Emily said she trusted my palate more than her own. And when the security deposit on the venue came due, $22,000, non-refundable, due in 10 days, and Emily's fiancé Ryan's family hadn't yet wired their promised contribution, I put it on my business line of credit without a second thought. "Just until Ryan's parents send their check," Emily said, hugging me in her kitchen. "You're a lifesaver, Claire, seriously." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? We were sisters. This was what sisters did. But the check from Ryan's parents was smaller than expected when it finally arrived, $12,000 instead of the $20,000 they'd discussed, and somehow, in the flurry of dress fittings and cake tastings and seating chart negotiations between 2 families who didn't especially like each other, nobody mentioned the difference. I covered it. I told myself I'd get reimbursed eventually. The way you tell yourself a lot of things when you love someone and don't want to be the person who brings up money at Thanksgiving. It was my mother who first said the words that should have warned me. "You know how weddings are," she said one evening in March, when I mentioned, gently, almost apologetically, that the total I'd fronted across deposits, tastings, and the block of hotel rooms for out-of-town guests had crossed $60,000. "Everyone contributes what they can. You're the one with the business. It makes sense that you'd handle the parts that need structure." "I know," I said. "I just want to make sure everyone understands it's a loan, not a gift. I'll need it back." My mother's face did something small and quick, a flicker I didn't fully register at the time. "Of course," she said. "Nobody's going to let you carry all of this yourself, Claire. Don't be dramatic." Don't be dramatic. I have thought about that phrase more times than I can count since then. It is, I have come to understand, one of the quietest and most effective tools in a certain kind of family arsenal, the ability to recast a reasonable boundary as an overreaction so that the person asking for fairness ends up apologizing for having asked. Emily, for her part, grew more distant as the wedding approached, in the specific way brides sometimes do, swallowed by her own event, unable to see past the horizon of her own happiness. When I brought up the deposits over brunch in April, she waved it off between bites of avocado toast. "Can we not talk about money right now? I'm trying to enjoy this. It's supposed to be the happiest time of my life." "I'm not trying to ruin it," I said. "I just need to know the plan for paying me back before the final vendor balances come due in June. That's 90,000 more, Em. I can't float that on top of what I've already covered." She looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, not anger exactly, but something colder, more assessing. "You're the one who offered to handle everything," she said. "I never asked you to put it all on your business. That was your idea." It was true, and it wasn't. I had offered to coordinate, to use my expertise, my vendor relationships, my organizational skill. I had never offered to personally underwrite a $250,000 wedding out of my own credit line, while everyone else treated their contributions as optional, aspirational, subject to revision. But somewhere in the months of "just until the check clears," and "don't be dramatic," and "you're so good at this," the story had quietly rewritten itself. I was no longer the sister who was generously helping. I had become the sister whose job it apparently was. I should have stopped there. I know that now. I should have called a lawyer in April, not in October. But I kept thinking of Emily's head on my shoulder on her apartment floor, and my mother's hand on my arm at the kitchen table, and I told myself that families worked things out, that this was simply what love cost sometimes, that I would rather be the person who gave too much than the person who counted too carefully. So I kept paying. The florist's final balance. The band's remaining fee. The calligrapher. The day of coordinator I hired, because I couldn't be both mother of the bride's helper and guest, the emergency alterations when Emily lost 8 pounds from stress in the final month, and her dress needed to be taken in twice. By the week of the wedding, I had personally covered just over $190,000. Not fronted, not loaned in any sense anyone had bothered to put in writing. Covered, sitting on my business credit line, drawing interest, while I told myself it would all sort itself out once the celebration was over and everyone came back down to earth. I remember standing in the dressing suite the morning of the wedding, zipping Emily into the dress I had personally driven 2 states over to collect from the designer's private atelier, and thinking, this is why it was worth it. She looked at herself in the mirror, tears in her eyes, and turned to me. "Thank you," she said. "For everything. I mean it, Claire. I couldn't have done any of this without you." I believed, standing there in that soft morning light with her veil in my hands, that those words were the payment. I did not yet know that the actual invoice, the one with numbers on it, the one that would arrive with no note attached, was still 24 hours away. The wedding itself was, by every external measure, perfect. The garden pavilion at the Ashford estate glowed under strings of amber lights as the sun went down behind the tree line. The peonies cascaded exactly as Emily had imagined them 11 months earlier, back when we sat on her apartment floor with ribbon samples and wine. The band played the first dance flawlessly. My father cried during the toast. My mother wore the mother of the bride dress I had helped her choose, and for one evening, everyone I loved was in the same room, laughing, dancing, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the woman quietly directing catering staff and reassuring nervous vendors from the edge of the dance floor was the same woman who had personally financed nearly all of it. During the reception toasts, Emily stood with a champagne glass in her hand and thanked, in order, her new husband, his parents for their generous support, their wedding planner, a woman I had hired and paid, whose name Emily used instead of mine, and our parents for giving me the wedding of my dreams. She did not mention me. Not once, in a toast that ran nearly 4 minutes. I stood near the back of the tent, holding my own glass, and told myself it didn't matter. She was overwhelmed. She would thank me privately later. People forget things at their own weddings. I had seen it a dozen times in my professional life. I smiled. I clapped. I told myself the story I needed to survive the evening. I did not hear from her later that night, or the next morning during the brunch, or that afternoon as the last of the rental trucks pulled away from the estate. What I heard at 8:14 the following morning was the soft chime of an email notification on my phone while I was still in bed, still sore from a week of standing on my feet, coordinating 14-hour vendor days. The email was from my mother. Forwarded, no note in the body, just a subject line, your contribution. Attached was a spreadsheet. My mother had, apparently with help from Emily and Ryan, spent the morning after the wedding compiling a full accounting of the celebration's costs, every vendor, every deposit, every dollar, cross-referenced against what had been contributed by each family. At the bottom, highlighted in pale yellow, was a single cell, outstanding balance, owed by Claire, $198,400. Below it, in my mother's handwriting, typed into the comments field, was a note that I have read so many times since that I could recite it without looking. We assumed this was your gift to your sister, since you were the one who insisted on handling everything yourself, but since you keep bringing up repayment, we've itemized what we believe is fair for you to formally absorb as your contribution. Let's not make this awkward, Claire. It's what family does. I sat in my bed for a long time, the phone screen dimming and relighting in my hand, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still. Not sad, exactly. Sad would come later, in waves, over the following weeks. What I felt in that first hour was closer to clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a pattern you have been refusing to see finally resolves into a shape you can no longer unsee. I did not cry. I did not call my mother screaming, though every part of the old version of me, the version who had spent 34 years being the reliable one, the capable one, the one who didn't cause trouble, wanted to. Instead, I made a pot of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop, and did something I am, in retrospect, deeply grateful I had done 11 months earlier, without even realizing its significance. Every single vendor contract for that wedding, the venue, the caterer, the florist, the band, the rental company, the calligrapher, had been signed not by Emily, not by Ryan, not by my parents, but by me, in my capacity as owner of Claire Whitfield Events, LLC. I had done this for a simple, practical reason. Commercial accounts meant better pricing, and better pricing meant I could stretch the budget further for my sister. It had never occurred to me, at the time, that I was doing anything other than being generous and efficient. But there was a clause. A standard clause, the kind buried in the boilerplate of nearly every commercial vendor contract my firm used, which I had personally drafted years earlier with my business attorney to protect my company from exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in, clients who tried to walk away from balances after services were rendered. The clause stated that in the absence of a signed, separate reimbursement agreement between the LLC and a third party, any funds advanced by Claire Whitfield Events, LLC, on behalf of a named client of record were considered a business receivable, payable on demand, secured against any property or deposits held in the name of the client of record. The client of record on every single contract was not Emily. It was my mother. She had asked, insisted actually, back in the very beginning, in that golden September afternoon at her kitchen table, to be listed as the primary contact on the venue and catering contracts. "It looks more established," she'd said at the time, waving a hand. "People take you more seriously when there's a homeowner's name attached, not just a young single woman's business." I had shrugged and agreed, because it cost me nothing and made her happy, and because at the time I had no idea that the vendors would eventually total nearly $200,000, or that anyone would ever try to hand that bill back to me, disguised as a gift I'd never agreed to give. My mother owned her house outright. She had paid it off 11 years earlier, the year my father's overtime finally caught up with their mortgage. It was, as far as I could tell from the county assessor's records I pulled that same morning, worth just over $400,000, free and clear of any lien. Until now. I called my attorney, Diane Marsh, at 9 a.m. sharp. I did not raise my voice once during that call. I simply read her the email, forwarded her the spreadsheet, and asked her one question. If I file the receivable against the client of record, what happens? There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a lawyer doing arithmetic she already suspects the answer to. If the balance isn't settled within the demand period specified in your standard contract language, Diane said slowly, you'd be entitled to file a judgment lien against any real property owned by the client of record, which is your mother's house. I sat with that for a long moment, looking out my kitchen window at the same amber morning light that, 11 months earlier, had fallen so gently across a table covered in ribbon samples and my sister's shining, trusting eyes. "Send the demand letter," I said quietly. "Give them 30 days. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday, sent by certified mail and, at Diane's suggestion, by email as well, so there could be no claim of it having gotten lost. It was brief, formal, and utterly without malice in its wording, the kind of letter that does its damage not through anger, but through precision. It stated, in plain language, that Claire Whitfield Events, LLC, had advanced $198,400 in vendor payments on behalf of the client of record, my mother, across 11 contracts signed between September and June. It stated that the funds constituted a business receivable, payable in full within 30 days, and that failure to remit payment would result in a formal lien being filed against real property held by the client of record, in accordance with the terms she herself had signed. I did not call my mother to warn her it was coming. I did not call Emily either. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I let the paperwork speak before I did. My phone rang 4 times that Tuesday evening. I let it ring. It rang 11 times more before 9 p.m. I made myself dinner, ate it slowly at my own kitchen table, and did not pick up. The following morning, my mother appeared at my office unannounced, still in the cardigan she wore to church, her face pale in a way I had never seen on her before. My assistant buzzed me with a voice that suggested she too understood something significant was unfolding. "You sent a lien notice," my mother said, before I had even fully stood up from my desk. Her voice cracked on the word, as though the letter itself had been an act of violence. "Against my house, Claire, the house you grew up in." "I sent a legal demand for repayment of a debt," I said. My voice was calm, calmer, I think, than I had expected it to be, as though some part of me had been rehearsing this moment for months without knowing it. The same debt you itemized and forwarded to me the morning after the wedding, with a note telling me not to make it awkward. That was different, she said. We were going to work something out as a family. You didn't have to involve lawyers. I tried to work it out as a family for 11 months, I said. I brought it up in March. I brought it up in April. Every time, I was told I was being dramatic, or that this was supposed to be the happiest time of Emily's life, or that I shouldn't talk about money. The only time anyone in this family put a number on paper was when you decided the number belonged to me. My mother's mouth opened and closed. Behind her, through the glass wall of my office, I could see my assistant very deliberately not looking in our direction. You could ruin us, she said finally, quieter now. You know what a lien does to a house? We'd never be able to refinance. We'd never be able to sell. I know exactly what it does, I said. I had 11 months to learn everything about the contracts I signed, because nobody else in this family thought to read them. You asked to be listed as client of record because you thought it made the wedding look more established. I let you, because it cost me nothing at the time. It costs you something now. She sat down, unbidden, in the chair across from my desk, the chair I use for new clients, for people who need me to organize the unmanageable parts of their lives into something orderly. It struck me, in that moment, as almost unbearably fitting. Emily says you're punishing her for being happy, my mother said. Emily didn't sign a single contract for her own wedding, I said. She doesn't know what any of this means, because she was never asked to. That's not my failure. That's a choice this family made a long time before that spreadsheet arrived in my inbox. Emily called that afternoon, and unlike my mother, she did not come in person. Her voice, when I picked up, had none of the softness of the girl who had leaned her head on my shoulder on her apartment floor. You're seriously going to take Mom's house over a wedding gift? It was never a gift, I said. I told you that in April. I told Mom that in March. You both told me not to be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic now, Emily. I'm reading you the same terms you signed under Mom's name, on contracts you never once asked to see. There was a long silence on the line. I didn't know it was that much money, she said finally, and for the first time in the entire conversation, her voice sounded genuinely young, genuinely unmoored, rather than performing offense. I thought everyone was just chipping in. I didn't think it was all coming from you. Nobody told you, I said. Because it was easier for everyone if the bride didn't have to think about it. That's not a crime, Em. But it's also not my debt to forgive just because nobody explained it to you. The 30-day window closed on a Thursday. 2 days before it did, Diane received a call from an attorney representing my mother, requesting a payment plan in lieu of the lien. I agreed to it, not out of softness, but because a payment plan, properly structured and notarized, accomplished everything the lien would have accomplished, without the specific cruelty of taking a woman's home out from under her. My mother would repay the balance over 4 years, with interest at a modest, legally defensible rate, secured, this time in writing, with everyone's actual signature, against her home equity. She signed it in Diane's conference room, her hand visibly unsteady, my father sitting beside her with an expression I could not read. Emily did not come. I did not expect her to. I don't understand how you could do this to your own mother, my mother said quietly, capping the pen. I didn't do anything to you, I said. I simply stopped being the only person in this family who read the paperwork. The house did not go into foreclosure. My mother made her payments, on time, every month, with a punctuality that struck me as almost painful in its precision, as though she were trying, through sheer financial discipline, to prove something to me that words no longer could. We did not have a dramatic reconciliation scene. There was no tearful phone call, no moment where she showed up at my door in the rain to apologize. What we had instead was quieter and, in its own way, more honest. A slow, careful thinning of contact that neither of us named out loud. 2 Christmases spent in the same room, speaking mostly about the weather, and a gradual understanding, unspoken but mutual, that something fundamental between us had been recalculated and could not be returned to its previous sum. Emily and I spoke more in the months that followed than I expected. Not often, and never easily, but she called on my birthday, and she sent a long, halting text one night in February that read, in part, "I keep thinking about the toast. I didn't even notice I hadn't thanked you until Mom sent that email. I think that's the part I'm most ashamed of, not that we asked you to pay it, that we didn't notice you were the one paying at all." I did not respond right away. I sat with it for 2 days before I wrote back, and what I wrote was short. "I believe you. That doesn't undo it, but I believe you. We have not fully repaired what happened. I don't know that we will. But we are, I think, honest with each other now in a way we were not before, which is its own kind of progress, even if it looks nothing like the warm, uncomplicated closeness we once had on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by ribbon samples and wine. I sold my events firm's remaining wedding division clients 8 months later and pivoted entirely into corporate event consulting, where the contracts are signed by companies with legal departments and nobody ever calls a receivable dramatic. I do not regret the years I spent helping build my sister's wedding. I regret, if anything, how long it took me to understand that being the capable one in a family is not the same thing as being valued by it, and that the two can, in fact, be entirely separate currencies, spent by different people for different reasons. Lessons from this story. Lesson 1. Being the responsible one is a role, not a character trait, and roles can be exploited by people who benefit from you never questioning them. Families often unconsciously assign each member a function: the golden child, the peacemaker, the one who handles things. That last role feels like a compliment. It is not always one. When your competence becomes the mechanism by which others avoid responsibility, the kindest thing you can do, for yourself and, eventually, for them, is to make your contribution visible, in writing, before it becomes invisible in memory. Lesson 2. Generosity without documentation is often mistaken, later, for obligation. This is not cynicism. It is simply how memory and self-interest interact over time. The people who benefit from your help will not always remember it the way you do, not out of malice, but because it is easier to believe you were fulfilling a duty than to sit with the discomfort of having been given something they never fully repaid. Protecting a gift with a paper trail is not a failure of trust. It is often the only thing that allows trust to survive contact with money. Lesson 3. Don't be dramatic is rarely about your tone. It is usually about someone else's discomfort with your boundary. Notice how often that phrase, or one like it, appears exactly at the moment a reasonable person is asking a reasonable question. It is worth learning to hear it, not as a verdict on your behavior, but as information about the speaker's priorities. Lesson 4. Real accountability rarely arrives as an apology. More often, it arrives as changed behavior, offered quietly, without an audience. My mother never said the words, "I'm sorry," in a way that satisfied the version of me that wanted a clean resolution. But she made every payment, on time, for 4 years without complaint. I have come to believe that this, the slow, unglamorous work of making something right, is worth more than any toast, any speech, any performance of remorse ever could be. Watch what people do after the consequences arrive. That is where the truth usually lives.